Your refrigerator is running right now. But in the summer of 2003, 50 million people across the northeastern United States lost power for up to 4 days. Temperatures hit 90 degrees. Food spoiled within hours. Families panicked. Grocery stores locked their doors. Ice sold out within the first afternoon. People drove 40 miles looking for a bag of frozen peas. However, 12 miles from the nearest substation, an Amish farmhouse sat quiet. Butter firm, milk cold, vegetables crisp, no generator, no ice delivery, no electric bill, same as it had been for 200 years. The family ate dinner that night the same way they ate dinner every night. Nothing changed for them. Nothing at all. So how did an entire modern grid fail while a hand-dug hole in a hillside kept a family fed all summer? 5 methods made that possible. Each one older than your great-great-grandfather, and every single one of them still works today. Here is what nobody teaches you in school. Heat is not a thing you add, it is a thing you remove. And for most of human history, people were extraordinarily good at removing it. They built their homes around that principle. They oriented their barns to face it. They dug into the earth because of it. Heat moves in exactly 3 ways. Conduction, direct contact between surfaces, the way a hot pan scorches a wooden table. Convection, warm air rising and carrying heat upward with it, the way a candle heats the ceiling before it heats the floor. Radiation, heat traveling as invisible waves through open space, the way sunlight burns your arm through a car window even in January. Every passive cooling method ever invented works by blocking 1, 2, or all 3 of these at once. The best ones block all 3 simultaneously, and they do it without a single moving part. The earth itself is the first tool. Below 4 feet of soil, ground temperature stabilizes between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. It does not matter if the surface above is baking at 100 degrees in July. 4 feet down, the temperature barely moves. The Earth is a thermal battery, and it charges itself every winter and holds that charge through the following summer with almost no loss. You cannot buy a battery that performs like that. You cannot manufacture one. You can only dig down to where it already exists. Evaporation is the second tool. When water turns to vapor, it pulls heat out of whatever surface it leaves behind. That is not folk wisdom. That is thermodynamics. A wet clay pot sitting in a dry breeze can drop its interior temperature 30 degrees below the surrounding air. 30 degrees. That is the difference between food that spoils in 2 days and food that lasts 2 weeks. Shade and airflow handle the third threat. Radiant heat from direct sunlight can be eliminated entirely by blocking line of sight to the sun. Moving air, even slow-moving air, strips heat from surfaces through convection. A shaded wall in a breeze stays 15 degrees cooler than an identical wall in direct sun with no airflow. These are not approximations. These are measurements taken by agricultural engineers who spent decades studying exactly this problem. The United States Department of Agriculture documented all of this. University extension services across the country published detailed records of root cellars, spring houses, and evaporative coolers keeping farm families fed through summers well into the 20th century. These are not myths. These are engineering solutions that predate the word engineering. The question is not whether they work. The question is which one works for your situation. If you had asked anyone in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania about root cellars back in 1910, they would have told you they were as ordinary as a kitchen table. Every farm had one. Every family depended on one. Children were sent down into them the way children today are sent to the refrigerator. They had no idea that within 50 years, the electric refrigerator would make the root cellar nearly invisible, erased from common knowledge so completely that most people alive today have never stood inside one. Never felt that first breath of cool earth air rising up from the dark. A root cellar is a room built into the earth. That is the entire concept. Dug into a hillside or excavated beneath a home's foundation, the cellar uses the surrounding soil as insulation. The walls do not need to be cooled. They are already cold. The earth holds its temperature the way a cast iron skillet holds heat, slowly, steadily, and for a very long time. You are not fighting the summer. You are borrowing from the winter that came before it. The numbers are not complicated. At a depth of 8 to 10 feet, ground temperature in most of the continental United States sits between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit from June through September. That is cold enough to keep butter solid, cold enough to slow bacterial growth in fresh milk, cold enough to keep carrots, turnips, beets, potatoes, and cabbages firm and edible for weeks without any intervention at all. No ice, no power, no compressor cycling on and off at 3 in the morning. But here is the detail that everyone missed at the time. A root cellar is not just a cold hole. It is a managed environment. The difference between a root cellar that works and one that fails comes down to 3 design decisions, and getting any one of them wrong costs you your food supply. Not some of it, all of it. The first decision is ventilation. A root cellar needs 2 vents, one low, one high. Cool night air enters through the low vent and pushes warm air out through the high vent. This is convection working for you deliberately. Without it, the cellar warms through the summer as the stored produce itself generates heat during respiration. Yes, vegetables breathe. They generate measurable heat as they do it, a process called biological heat load that agricultural engineers calculate when designing commercial cold storage. A sealed cellar traps that heat and defeats itself within weeks. The second decision is drainage. Water must move away from the cellar floor. A slight slope in the floor, as little as 1 inch per 8 feet, directs any moisture toward a gravel drain at the base of the wall. Standing water raises humidity to the point where mold becomes inevitable. It also softens earthen walls over time, destabilizing the structure from the bottom up. 18th century builders knew this without knowing the word hydrostatic. They graded their cellar floors before they laid a single stone, before they mixed a single batch of lime mortar. The third decision is the door. A root cellar door must be thick, tight-fitting, and free of light gaps. Light gaps are air gaps. Air gaps are the enemy. A well-built cellar door was often double-layered, an outer wooden door and an inner insulated door, sometimes packed with sawdust or dried moss between them. The goal was to make the transition from outside air to cellar air as abrupt as possible. Step through the outer door and you feel the temperature shift. Step through the inner door and you are in a different season entirely. Read that again. 2 vents, a sloped floor, a tight door. That is the entire system. No moving parts, no power source, no ongoing cost beyond the labor of building it. A 12-year-old with a shovel and a week of good weather could build a functional version of this. USDA historical records confirm that properly constructed root cellars maintain temperatures between 45 and 60 degrees through summer months across dozens of climate zones. Farm families in Virginia, Ohio, Minnesota, and Georgia all used variations of the same basic design, adapted to local soil conditions and frost depth. The design changed. The physics did not. Now for the honest limits, because nothing here gets sold to you. Humidity is the variable that root cellars cannot fully control on their own. The ideal humidity for most root vegetables is between 85 and 95%. Too dry and carrots shrivel within 2 weeks, their cell walls collapsing as moisture escapes. Too wet and apples rot and spread that rot to everything around them through airborne ethylene and fungal spores that move invisibly from crate to crate in the dark. The traditional solution was separation. Apples went in wooden crates lined with straw, isolated from root vegetables because apples emit ethylene gas that accelerates ripening in everything nearby. Potatoes went in dry sand. Cabbages were sometimes buried individually in the earthen floor, their roots still attached, standing upright as if they were still growing. The cellar was not one storage zone. It was several microenvironments managed by experience and attention, and the accumulated knowledge of every generation that had used that particular cellar before you. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. The families who understood their cellar's specific humidity patterns, who knew which corner ran driest in August, which wall sweated in September, which shelf stayed coldest through the first warm week of June, those families ate well through February. The families who treated the cellar as a passive box they could ignore did not. The difference between success and failure was not the construction. It was the management. It was the daily act of paying attention. A root cellar built correctly and tended carefully can keep a family's summer harvest viable from June through the following February. Historical records from Mennonite and Quaker farming communities in Pennsylvania document cellars that held potatoes in edible condition through 9 consecutive months without refrigeration, without ice, and without electricity. 9 months. From one harvest to the edge of the next. Up to this point, the root cellar had been the undisputed foundation of off-grid food preservation, the method every other technique was measured against. That was about to flip. The Ice King. It is January 1806. Frederick Tudor stands on the frozen surface of Fresh Pond in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The temperature is 12 degrees. His breath fogs in the gray morning air. The stakes are everything he owns, and he knows it. Tudor is 22 years old. He has already been laughed out of Boston's merchant circles once. His family thinks he is delusional. His plan is simple and completely insane. He wants to cut blocks of ice from New England ponds and ship them to the tropics, to Martinique, to Havana, to Calcutta. People tell him the ice will melt before it clears the harbor. They are wrong. But Tudor wasn't done yet. Not even close. He books a brig called the Favorite. He loads 130 tons of ice into the hold. No insulation, no refrigeration, just raw frozen lake water and sheer audacity. The ship arrives in Martinique on February 5th. Most of the ice survives. The locals have no idea what to do with it. Tudor has no ice house waiting, no customers, no infrastructure. He loses nearly $5,000 on the first voyage alone. In 1806 money. He is ruined on paper. He keeps going. So he builds the system that the idea required. He studies sawdust. He discovers that dry sawdust packed tightly around ice blocks acts as a near-perfect insulator. The air pockets between the wood fibers trap cold. The low thermal conductivity of dry wood resists heat transfer. He patents the method. He builds ice houses in port cities across the Caribbean. He trains workers to cut, pack, and store ice with military precision, the angle of the saw cut, the depth of the sawdust layer, the spacing between blocks to allow meltwater to drain without pooling. By the 1830s, he is shipping ice to Rio de Janeiro. By the 1840s to Bombay. By 1856, Frederick Tudor is worth millions. The newspapers call him the Ice King. The title sticks. But the ice house wasn't just a commercial operation, it was a technology. And ordinary farmers had been using a version of it for centuries before Tudor turned it into a global empire. Here is how it worked at the farm scale. Farmers cut lake and river ice every January and February when the freeze ran deepest. They waited for blocks 12 to 18 inches thick. Anything thinner wouldn't last the summer. They used two-man cross-cut saws and iron tongs working in teams, the ice groaning and cracking beneath them in the pre-dawn cold. They dragged the blocks by horse to a timber frame structure built into a hillside, always on the north-facing slope, always shaded from direct afternoon sun. The walls were doubled. The gap between them was packed with sawdust, sometimes a foot deep, sometimes more. The floor was elevated on wooden slats so meltwater could drain without pooling beneath the ice and accelerating the melt from below. The ice went in. More sawdust went over the top. The door was sealed. And then they waited. Come August, when the air temperature hit 90 degrees and the creek ran low and warm and the fields shimmered with heat, they opened that door. The cold air rolled out like something alive. The ice was still there. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to keep butter solid, enough to chill milk through the night, enough to preserve a side of pork through the worst of the summer heat. Documented accounts from New England farms in the 1870s describe ice lasting well into September, 8, sometimes 9 months after the January harvest. You would think someone would have said something. Nobody did, because it wasn't remarkable to them. It was just Tuesday. The physics is straightforward. Ice absorbs heat as it melts, a process called latent heat absorption. 1 pound of melting ice absorbs roughly 144 BTUs of heat energy. The sawdust slows the rate of heat transfer from the outside air to the ice surface. The shaded north-facing wall reduces solar gain. The hillside location keeps the structure partially below grade, where ground temperature stays cooler. Every element of the design is doing thermodynamic work. Even if the farmers who built them never used that language, they used the language of results. The ice is still there. The pork is still good. That was enough. Building one today is not complicated. A simple timber frame, double walls with a 12-inch sawdust gap, a shaded north-facing site, elevated floor slats, a tight door with a sawdust-packed threshold. The honest limit is this: you need a winter ice source and dry sawdust storage. In climates without a hard freeze, the system does not work. In wet climates where sawdust stays damp, insulation efficiency drops sharply. This is not a universal solution, but where conditions are right, it is extraordinarily effective. Frederick Tudor understood something that most people missed entirely. Cold is not a product. Cold is the absence of heat. And if you can slow the movement of heat long enough, you can carry winter all the way into August. But this wasn't just about ice anymore. It was about who controlled the cold, and what happened when that control was taken away from ordinary people and handed to a global supply chain that could fail on a Tuesday afternoon in August when the wrong transmission line went down. The pot that shouldn't work. It is 1995. Mohammed Ba Abba is a teacher in northern Nigeria. The temperature outside is 104 degrees Fahrenheit. He is standing in a market watching vegetables rot in real time. Tomatoes softening on the table, spinach yellowing at the edges, peppers losing their firmness in the dry afternoon heat. Vendors fan the flies away. It does not help. Abba knows something most people in the development world have forgotten. He grew up watching his father sell clay pots in this same market. He knows what the pots can do. But the version you have heard about is not the full picture. The Zir pot is not a new invention. It is not a design breakthrough. It is a rediscovery. 2 clay pots, one inside the other, with wet sand filling the gap between them, a wet cloth draped over the top. That is the entire system. No moving parts, no electricity, no refrigeration unit, no compressor, just clay, sand, water, and physics that has been operating the same way since before anyone thought to write it down. Here is what happens. The outer pot is porous and unglazed. Water seeps through its walls slowly and evaporates on the outer surface. Evaporation requires energy. That energy is pulled directly from the contents of the inner pot, drawing heat outward through the wet sand and through the porous clay wall and releasing it into the dry air as water vapor. The interior temperature drops 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit below the ambient air temperature. In a 100-degree environment, the inside of that pot can reach the low 80s. In a very dry environment with low humidity, it can drop further still. Spinach that would rot in 2 days stays fresh for 2 weeks. Tomatoes last 3 weeks. Carrots stay crisp for a month. And the timing of what happened next? Almost too perfect. Abba takes this ancient technology and scales it. He organizes local potters, standardizes the sizes so that one pot fits reliably inside another, and distributes the coolers to rural communities across the Sahel region of Nigeria. By 2000, he has distributed more than 30,000 pot-and-pot coolers. Families that had never owned a refrigerator suddenly have a way to keep food safe through the hottest months of the year. Girls who had been kept home from school to sell vegetables in the market, because the vegetables would spoil if left unattended for even a few hours, are now able to go to school. Because the vegetables keep. Because the pot works. In 2000, Mohammed Ba Abba wins the Rolex Award for Enterprise. The prize money is $50,000. He uses it to distribute more pots. You would think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Because the technology had been sitting in plain sight for centuries. In India, the matka, a single unglazed clay pot, has been used to cool drinking water for at least 4,000 years. Street vendors across Rajasthan and Gujarat still sell matka water today, pouring it into small clay cups that cool the water further as you hold them. The principle is identical. Evaporation, heat transfer, physics that costs nothing and belongs to everyone. The build cost for a Zir pot is under $10 in materials. In regions where clay and sand are locally sourced, the cost approaches zero. The outer pot must be unglazed. Glazed clay is waterproof and defeats the entire mechanism by sealing the pores that make evaporation possible. The sand between the pots must be kept wet, refreshed daily in dry climates, sometimes twice daily during the hottest weeks. The cloth on top must stay damp. In high humidity environments, the system loses efficiency because the air is already saturated with water vapor, and evaporation slows to almost nothing. This is the honest limit. In humid coastal climates, the Zir pot underperforms significantly. In dry inland heat, the Sahel, the Rajasthani desert, the American Southwest, it is remarkably, almost offensively effective. There is something almost offensive about how simple this is. A pot inside a pot, wet sand, a damp cloth, and the heat retreats. Abba's work spread beyond Nigeria. NGOs began distributing Zir pots across Sudan, Ethiopia, and Chad. Agricultural researchers at the Food and Agriculture Organization documented the results carefully. Post-harvest losses in participating communities dropped by as much as 50%. 50%! Not because of a new technology, Because of an old one that had been ignored while the world was busy building supply chains that required electricity, refrigerated trucks, and infrastructure that most of the planet does not have and may never have. The same success that built ABBA's legacy was about to undermine it. Cheap plastic containers flooded rural markets across West Africa through the early 2000s. Lighter, cheaper, easier to transport, easier to stack. Families began choosing plastic over clay, the pots stopped selling, the potters stopped making them. The knowledge began to thin out again, the same way it always does, quietly, without announcement, without ceremony. Until one day someone stands in a market watching vegetables rot in the afternoon heat and wonders if there was ever a better way. There was. There still is. The Springhouse never asked for anything back. The real question is not whether any of this works. The physics has not changed. The Earth is still cold 4 feet down. Ice still absorbs heat as it melts. Evaporation still pulls energy from whatever surface it leaves behind. The real question is why we stopped. Why we handed all of that accumulated knowledge to a power grid and then forgot we had ever known it. And what it would take: a blackout, a supply chain failure, a summer that runs 10 degrees hotter than the last, to make us remember.